Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Some More Creepy Stories, Volume 1, Story 1. We had taken a summer job working road construction in San Antonio. This was a buddy of mine many years ago when I was in college. And the job was building a road. We called it a highway turnaround. You know, when you exit the highway, you pass underneath the bridge to go back to the other side of the highway without having to merge into traffic underneath two huge bridges passing in front of the entrance to Lackland Air Force Base. It was pretty early in the construction phase of the project. We were just building the turnaround road itself, and there was a 3 to 4 foot deep ditch between the road and the incline up to the bridge. No retaining wall yet, that came later. There was a lot of noise from machines and local traffic. I mean, it was loud. That year, or the one before, backup beepers were required to be installed on the big machines. You know, put the machine in reverse, the beeper blares. While the superintendent in charge of the site didn't like the backup beepers and had them disconnected. Bad move for us. One day my buddy and I were standing on the north side of the westbound bridge, talking with the state civil engineer. We were on pretty good terms and traded insults as he walked away, got in his truck, waved, and drove off. My buddy was to my right. I just happened to glance back to my right, and I saw the rear right tire of a road maintainer, think grader with large flat blade hung from the frame in between the two front wheels and the back four wheels, coming right at us, fast. The beeper was disconnected, so we were oblivious to the danger. I touched my buddy's arm, and suddenly we were both shoved halfway up the incline. We hit so hard up the incline that it knocked the breath out of both of us and put a dent in my hard hat. Then the machine roared past, the operator oblivious to our presence. We were stunned, and my buddy was the first one to speak. He said, "Thanks for pushing him out of the way." I said, "Huh? I just touched your arm. There wasn't enough time to shove, and I'm not strong enough to push him and me that far, that fast." He said the tire had just brushed his thigh. It was that close. We would have been squished like bugs. Like I said, we landed halfway up the slope. Now, maybe it wasn't our day to die, or we have a guardian angel who watches over us. You pick for yourself. I know the truth. Story number 2. This happened back in the 1980s. I was setting up traps to make some extra money. We lived in a small town and a very rural, 20 miles to the nearest Taco Bell area of Illinois. One evening in December, I asked my father to drive me out to my cousin's farm to set some traps. By the time we got there, it was nearly dark. I headed down into the creek bottom 300 yards below my cousin's house. My father went into the garage where my cousin was working to chat. By the time I got down to the creek and finished my business, it was after dark. Suddenly, from the brush about 100 yards across the creek, perhaps even further, came a scream, a roar that sounded like I don't know what. Too high for a human, too low for a panther, bobcat, or owl. In nearly 50 years of hanging around in the woods in several states, I haven't heard anything like it. I have been up close and personal with things like bobcats, coyote, alligator, and cottonmouth, but nothing scared me like this. I could have outrun Usain Bolt getting back up to my cousin's. My father and cousin heard it from inside the garage with all the doors closed. He stepped outside and saw me streaking toward the house. He later claimed that my shoes were smoking when I got there. I have spent the last 30 plus years trying to convince myself that it was a screech owl, and my imagination just got the better of me. I night hunt the area with my 12-year-old son in the present, but I won't go across the creek unless it is broad daylight. A few days ago I was reading someone's post where they described the same sound and heard it in the Pacific Northwest. I don't believe in Bigfoot or other such things, but 30 plus years later and 300 miles away, and I have chills running up my spine just thinking about that night. And I guess I'll just try to keep convincing myself that it was an owl. Next story. I lost my job, my vehicle, my place to live, and my business partner all in 3 days. I had just enough money for an apartment, a POS car. I had a million people offering me a place to stay, and I immediately lined up a new job. But it didn't start for 5 weeks. So I bought an old Ford Explorer and decided that I would camp out in the Wharton State Forest of southern New Jersey until my new job was to start. Keep in mind, this was the winter of 2014, and the month that I decided to camp out in December was cold. I moved from area to area in the forest for the first few weeks, camping illegally, and for the last 2 weeks of my time out there, I decided to actually rent a campsite in a primitive camping area on the Mulika River. Due to the time of year, I was the only person at the campsite the whole time. Now, have you ever heard of the Jersey Devil? Now, you will find the same as I did that the whole story is ridiculous. Every night, though, I would have a huge fire and enjoy the cold, crisp air as the coyotes circled my camp in the darkness just beyond my firelight. Now, the morning of December 14th, I woke at 5:30 a.m. in the back of my SUV, and I saw that it had snowed lightly the night before, about an inch of snow or so, and for once, I didn't see the dozens of coyote prints I was used to, but there was something else. Giant split hoof prints, patterned in a bipedal fashion, with what appeared to be a tail drag. These prints looked just like deer tracks, but huge, larger than moose tracks. Whatever it was had apparently walked a few circles around my vehicle while I slept. I followed the track with my flashlight in the early morning darkness, and the tracks went around the vehicle, across my campsite, and ended at a pretty large pin oak tree. I stopped for a moment and wondered if I wanted to look up, and when I did, the tree was empty. I'm still not sure as to what it really was that left those tracks, and in a way I'm glad I don't. Next story. This happened back in 2015. I was down at the archery range as normal after work on Tuesday, and I ended up chatting to the coach for ages as the rest of the archers left. The indoor range in this derelict social club is in the middle of a field on the side of a football ground. By the time I had finished chatting with the coach and left, it was pitch black, cloudy evening, and no moon. I was walking my way up the concrete path to the car park in the darkness, loaded up with my bow and other gear. I can just about see the path. Then I get that feeling I'm being watched. This was all of a sudden. Then I put my gear down and crouched for a bit, listening. I heard a few dodgy sounds coming from the car park. Thought about my beloved SUV in there, picked up my gear and crept up to the car park. Now I spotted one guy in a hoodie, crouched down hiding by my motor. Shame on me, I only had my tiny LED Lenser keyring torch, but it was enough to shine on him. He got up and slunk away behind a load of old shipping containers in the car park. I legged it to the car, loaded up, locked it, and started to drive out quick. Oh no, the coach, I think, as I'm about to leave the gates. He's an older guy. And then he would have been carrying loads of pricey archery gear and the cash box from the range, on his own in the dark with his guy skulking around. I turned the car around and drove back into the car park with my lights off. Drove down the side of the containers where this guy went, then banged on the full beams to see where he was hiding. The headlights revealed a group of these guys in hoodies, hiding in the darkness behind the containers. Obviously, they had been watching me as their buddy hid by my car. Needless to say, they didn't like being in the limelight. That, plus me screaming to them to go forth and multiply repeatedly out the window while screaming after them in the car, made them leg it. I stuck around and waited for the coach. Now, this is a closed gate and I thought a secure site, so that meant they had to have been there, and my car was fine, no damage, which made me worry that he was crouched by waiting for me. I'm not sure what that little flashlight helped me avoid: a quick slapping, a robbery of all my archery gear, gang rape, organ harvesting. Paying attention to that feeling is definitely important. Needless to say, I will be packing a 4D Maglite clone with my bow next week. I'll at least take some teeth out before I get jumped. Next story. It was deer hunting, early bow season in western Wisconsin. We had scouted earlier and we knew the area. This was me and my friend. We drove in and parked and then walked in off the corner of a couple of fire trails, maybe 200 or 300 yards. It was totally dark, forest, but a lot of pine, not much undercover. It was somewhat rolling terrain, but it was easy walking, and we didn't bring flashlights. I got to my spot. My buddy went into his chosen location, maybe 100, 125 yards further in. He would be roughly on my 10 o'clock. It was probably around 4:30 a.m. We wanted everything to settle down. It was a great location and several deer trails passing through to a swampy area across the road. It was a nice morning to be in the woods. My eyes became somewhat accustomed to the dark, and I could vaguely make out the trunks of the pines surrounding me, black compared to very dark gray. My shooting lane was pretty open from about 11 to 1 o'clock out to about 50 yards. Somewhere around 5:45 a.m., false dawn, my buddy decides to change positions. I see him pass left to right in front of me out about maybe 55 yards, barely visible. He is crouched over, not making a sound, passes out of sight. I'm a little miffed. What was the point of coming in so early if we're going to be wandering around? Oh well, it was his area, I was the guest. Well, after it gets light, and there's been no deer moving at all, I got up, stretched, packed up my stuff, and headed straight out. At the same time, I see my buddy coming back out from the left. I waited until he got up to me and asked, "Why did you move? And how did you get back to your original stand?" He looked quizzical. "I never moved. I told him I saw him. Gave him the story." He shook his head. "Wasn't me." Not many theories will fit this. Another hunter would make sense, but he sure didn't drive in, and his license would have to say Quasimodo. A bear? Maybe. A hunchback bear? Walking on his hind legs? My hunting buddy was an AMVET, the kind that went out in the bush and took the war to the VC on extended patrols. He had skills, and maybe some demons to deal with. My best guess is that it really was him, and he circled back out of sight. But he says no, and it really wouldn't have made sense to do that. Next story. This is actually a true story my grandfather told me that he was a witness to. This story took place in the early 1940s when my grandfather was a young teen. The setting is northern Maine. Now northern Maine is very rural to this day, but in the 1940s it was really God's country. The interstate had yet to go through, and many, if not most, roads were yet to be paved. My grandfather was working with his father, brother, and uncles as lumberjacks, cutting timber. They had very limited funds, so there was only one log truck and no boom to load logs onto it. They were way off the beaten path, at least 10 miles from the nearest town, well into the forest. When they logged, they would build camps and hovels and stay in for a month or a month and a half until they finished and moved on to other woodlots. The crew had gotten into a stand of old growth that had a lot of value. When they got to the ground and limbed, they ran into a problem. The timber was too heavy to load onto the truck. Their method was to use ramps and cant dogs to lever the logs up, but try as they might, they just couldn't do it. As they stood around ruminating on their next move, they saw a person approaching the yard walking up a twitch road. Now keep in mind, these guys are way back in the woods, not a place you just happened upon. None of the crew had ever seen this man before. My grandfather described him as short and slim and probably in his mid-60s. He asked what the problem was. My great-grandfather, who headed up the crew, explained their dilemma. The visitor took a look at the situation and told great-grandfather to take the boys into camp and feed them dinner, and he would take care of it. These guys were mostly young and quite strong from working in the woods all their lives. You can imagine their thoughts when this small old guy said he would do alone what they couldn't do together. But incredulously they retreated to camp for some grub. After about 20 minutes, the old guy came inside and asked for some food. Well, after a few minutes of ribbing from the guys about how he couldn't do the job either, the visitor said, "Well, let's go take a look." So the guys went over to the woodyard, and sure enough, the truck was fully loaded with the old growth timber. The guys couldn't believe it. To be done alone and so quickly seemed impossible. The visitor insisted they go back to camp and finish dinner. Of course, there were many questions, but the old man was coy and wouldn't give up his secret. As he finished and got up to go, my great-grandfather asked him one more time how he did it. All the man said as he walked out the door is that the old people know how. With that, he walked back out into the forest. According to my grandfather, that night was a long one for the boys. Their unanswered questions began to unsettle them, and they talked amongst themselves, trying to find an explanation. At that time in northern Maine, it was very rural, and there were few churches. Rumors of witchcraft and paganism were common. The guys did not believe it was a spirit that visited them, as he seemed human and even ate with them. My grandfather told me the consensus was that the loggers felt there was some sort of witchcraft or sorcery involved in what the stranger did. He insisted on privacy and did the unthinkable so quickly and without machines. Most of the loggers, being superstitious, were very uncomfortable with what happened, and they had many questions. Where did he come from? Where did he go? How did he just happen upon them so deep in the woods? And of course, how did he do it? The guys pulled out of that spot only a few days later, as they were so spooked by what happened, and most didn't want to work in the forest alone anymore. My grandfather told me this story many times, and it clearly had a big impact on him throughout his life. It led to a lifetime of him being interested in the paranormal, and he never forgot it. He was the last living member of that logging crew up until he passed away 4 years ago. I suppose now he knows the secret of what happened that day. Next story. This happened when I was a kid. The first time I remembered it was in Fort Worth, Texas, and my stepdad was stationed at Carswell Air Force Base. We used to go out to his friend's house out in the boonies a lot. They had a few kids, and other friends had kids. We were out there one time, and there was a lot of talk about the goat man for some reason. All of us kids decided we would play in the woods and field behind their property while the adults did their thing. We were walking through the trees and woods and came out on the other side in a cornfield. We could see a barn down at the other end of the field, and we decided to go and check it out. As we got closer, I remember feeling uneasy and wanting to go back to the house where the adults were. Some of the older kids wouldn't have given me crap for wussing out, so I didn't say anything. We got to the barn, and one of the older kids opened up the main barn door, and there were dead chickens all over the place. On the floor of the barn was a pentagram with candles lit about it. There may have been other dead animals, but I distinctly remember a lot of dead chickens. One of the older kids said we needed to get out of there, and as he said it, we heard this god-awful screech or scream come from the field. We all looked towards that part of the field where it came from, and I remember seeing a ram's head, like a bighorn sheep's head, running through the field towards the barn. Instinctively, we all ran back the other way to where the adults were. I'm not sure how long of a run it was, but it had to have been a few 100 yards at least. We got back to the house, and we were all freaking out. The parents were asking what the heck was going on. I remember one of the older boys said we saw the goat man. I remember him explaining to his dad what he saw. He told him about the barn, and that whatever was running towards us had the head of a goat and the body of a man. I don't remember seeing the body, maybe because I was so short at the time, or maybe because of a bad angle. But I do remember that head coming through the cornfield. They contacted police, and I'm not sure what happened after that. I asked my parents a few times, and they always told me to forget it and would just change the subject. Next story. This was opening day of bow season, and I have done zero scouting but hunted the area the previous 2 seasons, only difference being this year the land was leased to game and fish, and they closed the roads, providing a longer hike than normal. This year was my grandfather was accompanying me, which is a blessing and a curse. So 30 minutes into the hike with bows in hand and climbers on our back in the pristine 90-degree weather, we get to where the grandfather wants to hunt. Get our climber on the tree and get situated, and I walk back towards the truck 300 yards and veer off to a bottom with a creek that was full of sign last year. I got in there, and it's thick, nowhere I like, and no sign, no acorns droppings, but hey, I'm here and I have no time to change plans. It'll be dark in a few hours. I got up the tree, had to climb back down, readjust the stand, climb back up, and I'm pouring sweat, cussing myself for going early while it's hot. Then I find I've forgotten my thermocell. So I'm being eaten alive by skeeters the size of crows. There is zero phone service here and no way to communicate. In my years hunting there, I've had it to myself and I've rarely seen anyone. If I do, it's only on the main road. About an hour before dark, I started to hear a noise, but I didn't pay it any mind because I was too busy finding the mosquitoes. Well, after about 5 minutes of the noise, I finally started listening. And I thought it was a cow bellowing. Nope. Maybe an owl? Nope. Couple hounds? Had to be. Nope. After another 10 minutes of this terrible, long, drawn-out moaning coming from the ridge across the road in the direction of the truck, I decided I'm not going to be there when whatever it is gets there. I climbed down the tree, packed up quick, and made it back to the road. I went and I picked up my grandfather, scared him to death because I was so stealthy. I don't know, maybe he's going deaf, I don't know. The next question, knowing how dedicated I am and I always sit until I can't see the ground, was, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "I'm hot, sweating to death, and fighting mosquitoes. I'm ready to go. Also, I'm not going to be here when whatever is making that moaning noise gets here." He says he hasn't heard a thing. And he gets down and we're packing up, and he says that something has semicircled him in the thicket, but he couldn't see it, and that it smelled like a musky wet dog or dog poop, something like that. I said, "Probably a bear." At this point, the sun is going down and the light is fading. I can see the truck, and my stand clanks in my ear at every step. I thought I heard a strange noise, but wasn't sure with the stand clanking. Then between clanks, I hear it. It's two long whoops. I said, "What the is that?" We listened to it a few more times, and it sounded like it was just on the other side of the road, right next to the truck. I couldn't see onto the main road for the thick growth of briar and honeysuckle growing up. I set my stand down quietly as possible at the truck and told my grandfather to stay there. I drew out my G19 wishing I had brought the G20 instead, and looked up the main road expecting to see a man calling his dogs. Nothing. No one. Just silence, no wind, nothing. No new tire tracks in the powder dust crossing my tracks from coming in. We loaded up, and we went talking about it on the way home. Got home, and at this point, I've had over 27 years in the woods. I've never heard this sound. I had written off the moaning, but couldn't get over that strange whoop. I started researching various owls and birds native here and found nothing. I started playing Sasquatch vocal recordings. Nope, nope. Then bam. My hair stood up on end and a chill went down my spine. The Ohio howls. Exact match to what I had heard, except I heard it for over 10 minutes. Then after more, the Sierra sounds. Exact match to the whoops. Scared me to death. My grandfather would not hunt there with me again until after gun season came, after he heard those recordings. I've never felt comfortable on that particular mountain, but pushed on to have a chance at the big bucks there. The previous year, I got out by myself for an evening hunt and started up that same road. I started to get that feeling of being watched and kept going until I had an overwhelming sense of not being welcome that evening. I hightailed it out. I have a good amount of Comanche in me, and my buddy is mostly Crow and Blackfeet. He hates hunting that area and basically refuses to do so unless he is within sight of me. Said it just gives him the woolies. Next story. This is a story that happened to my great-grandfather in northern New Mexico. He told the story to my grandfather, and my grandfather told it to me. My great-grandfather had been noticing that certain things around the farm were missing or misplaced. It wasn't just specific things, but all sorts of things, from tools to pencils to feed buckets. Anyway, he kept noticing a coyote around the farm as well, and noticed that every time he was looking for something, he'd catch the coyote in the corner of his eye. As soon as he would get ready to get a rifle to shoot the coyote, it was gone. One day he decided that he would get up earlier than usual and have the horse ready with his gun in the scabbard so he could try and catch the coyote coming onto his property. Sure enough, the coyote stepped out of the tree line right as the sun came up. The coyote saw him and bolted. He gave chase and caught up to it near some pine trees that had all grown together. He chased the coyote around the trees and finally got his rifle on it. As soon as this happened, the coyote stopped and turned into an old lady. She begged my great-grandfather not to shoot her. He apparently knew who she was and told her that no harm better come to his family and she better stay off his land, otherwise he would kill her. After that incident, no other items on the farm went missing or were misplaced. I can't verify the story because my great-grandfather died before I was born. My grandfather said this story had to have been true because his father never lied, and there was a lot of witchcraft going on in the area. People are still superstitious in that area. In fact, if you're an outsider, they won't even talk to you. Next story. I used to like scouting and camping in foul weather. I felt I gained more actual real-world experience. On this occasion, again rain, I had my youngest son, who was about 12 at the time, with me. We were in my old International C-120 pickup truck and got to the campsite late. It was raining pretty steady, so we chose to sleep in the cab for the night and would set up camp in the morning. We ate a quick cold ration or two and more or less fell asleep. About 1 o'clock in the morning, my son shook me. I came out of my dozing and figured he was cold, so I reached to turn on the ignition to get the heat going, and he stops me, signaling shh. Suddenly, I'm wide awake. What's up? He points to his ear, the signal to listen. We go breathless for several seconds. Nothing. I quietly whispered, "What did you hear?" He says back really quiet, his voice shaking, "Something is outside the truck." A cold chill went up my spine, and I slowly reached for my Colt M1911, and really intently I tried to peer into the pitch black outside the truck. The windows were steamed up, the rain drizzling down outside. I took a towel and wiped the windows, expecting to see it looking back at me. My son, he's trembling, he was so scared. I calmed him. "What did you hear?" He said, "Something big." Oh God, now I'm shaking. Where we were at was really remote. Date was out of hunting season, and due to the bad weather, absolutely no one else would be out there. I knew the area like the back of my hand, and quickly flashed all the possibilities of what it could be. Nothing but possibly cattle or deer would fill the bill. So I quietly asked him, "Well, what did it sound like?" His immediate whispered reply was, "Human footsteps, real slow in the mud." Now my nerves were really twanging. I would rather be a Bigfoot than a human. To my knowledge, no crypto beast had ever harmed a human, but plenty of humans had. I absolutely trusted my son's word, for he was a super sharp kid, very responsible, and though quick to play a joke, I knew from the way he was looking, he was as serious as anything. I hesitated, but I was thinking about it. As jangled as I was and with my son in the truck, I did not want to take a chance of an accidental discharge with my gun, so I decided we had to get light on the subject. I would flip on the nice set of work lights on the rack, front and rear, reach for the switch. It would just be a few seconds of really bright light. They were a heavy draw on the battery without the engine running, but I figured if someone was out there, the sudden bright light would ruin their night vision. I closed one eye, told him to do the same, and took to look out the front and rear and right side, and I would do the same for the left. I flipped a switch and was completely stunned. We were right in the middle of a herd of huge brown and white cattle. They had bunch protection up close to the truck without touching it, but all were silent and snoozing. We had not even heard a single cow fart, and they were so close you could roll down the window and pet them. I always thought cattle would huddle under trees during rain if trees were around, and there were trees all around the little meadow clearing we were in. Not one cow had so much as snorted or touched the truck. I had never even heard of that behavior of cattle before. The scene was just surreal. I flipped off the lights and said, "Well, we're safe. If anything comes at us now, we're in the middle of the herd. It's going to have to get through those bovines first." We went back to sleep. I suspect that what he heard as human footsteps in the mud was just a nearby cow plopping his duty. By morning, the rain had stopped, the cows were gone, but we had to find another campsite. The one we had been waiting for was covered with fresh prairie fertilizer. Next story. It was the summer of 1983 and I was 16 years old. A friend of mine lived in the closest town, roughly 3 miles west of where I lived. I'll call it a mini country subdivision. I was supposed to stay overnight at my friend's house but decided to leave around 2 a.m. as I didn't feel well. Knowing my mom would chew me out for calling her for a ride at that hour, I decided to walk it down the highways I'd done many times before and just sneak in to avoid getting yelled at until the next day. I'd taken an alternate route before by way of train tracks running parallel to the highway, about a quarter mile off, but always got spooked out there with no lights and animals crossing the tracks further up ahead in the dark, but never close enough to discern what the animals were. So I decided on the state highway. I'd walked the highway many times and mostly only had truckers honk and maybe a cat call from a car as they pass. This night was no different except for a nagging feeling I had. Most of the 3 miles were rolling hill farms, and the last half mile or so was a single bulb light at a rustic crossroad. Beyond that, a narrow strip of highway with a 40-foot high embankment on my left and a low swamp pond close to the shoulder on the right. Usually, when walking, I would jump over the culvert up to an embankment when I heard 18-wheelers coming, and then back down again to the gravel when they passed, especially in icy, slippery weather. However, in this little final strip of highway, there really is nowhere to go quickly. It's either climb 40 feet or jump in and swim the swamp, so it was always a little sketchy in that spot. Before the crossroad light, there is a large hill to climb. I'm tired and it's now 3 a.m. I got to the crossroad light, and I know it's just a short distance more. As I walked under the light, a car pulls up, slows, and a guy asks me if I'm all right and if I need a ride someplace. We were told never to hitchhike, and I never did. I politely told him no thank you and that I lived nearby while waving my hand in a vague direction so as not to give any details. He began to scan for houses. There weren't any. He was driving alongside me at my walking pace, and I'm on his passenger side and he's speaking through the open window. He keeps saying that a young girl should not be walking on the highway so late, and it's really no problem for him to give me a ride. I tried to get a look at him to judge his age, though I actually knew him as one of the many young dads whose children I may have babysat for coming back after a bar closed. Was that maybe who it was? It was too dark to see as we moved away from one dim light, and I didn't recognize the voice. He was trying to seem soothing, and for a moment I had some thought about how he may have a daughter and is just concerned. I again thanked him and said I was fine and didn't have to go far. I was now on that narrow strip of road with the embankment and the pond. I suddenly heard a voice in my head tell me not to, under any circumstances, get in this car. Do not get in the car. His voice became even more pleading for me just to take the ride. I started to get panicky in a claustrophobic situation with having nowhere to run off the highway. If I bolt his direction crossing the rear of his car and end up the embankment, he'd probably be out of his seat and get to grab my ankles as I scramble upwards, and I don't want to get in that swamp water. He suddenly braked and put the car in park. I had calmly refuted his offers, and just as he stopped, I was a few feet shy of the far edge of the pond, so I gave it all I had and bolted about 50 feet up the gravel, around the pond, into the line of corn at the edge of the mini subdivision, and disappeared, ducking and weaving behind, alongside, around houses and garages. This guy pulled into the access road and was driving up and down the 8 or so small streets in between homes, looking for me and yelling things like, "I know where you're hiding and I'll find you," and stuff like that. The voice had instantly changed to hostile and scary. I'd freeze in a shadow and he would wait, engine running, trying to flush me out. I heard him drive around me onto the next street, and I ran as fast as I could to my door and began pounding on it as I heard the car engine circle back around. My dad opened the door, and I pushed in and locked it, out of breath, dirty, and shaking like a leaf. I tried to explain what happened. We heard him drive through in front of the house and then leave. I never walked alone on the highway, ever again, day, night, or otherwise.